My parents threw me out for my golden child sister. Years later, karma hit them back. Hello, read it. Most people grow up believing that family is supposed to be their greatest source of love and support, the one constant in life that never wavers no matter what happens. It's what we're told from childhood. Family always comes first. Family always stands by you. Family is forever. But not all families work that way. Some are fractured from the inside, held together only by a thin illusion of unity. Some families pick favorites, making one child feel like royalty while the other is left wondering why they were even born. And when that illusion finally cracks, when the truth of how little you actually matter becomes undeniable, there is no worse feeling in the world. I learned that lesson young. My name is Eric Miller, and I'm 25 years old now. I haven't spoken to my parents in 8 years. I cut them out of my life completely, not by choice at first, but because they made the decision for me. When I was 17, they threw me away like I was nothing, just because my older sister Vanessa decided she didn't want me around anymore. That was all it took. One tantrum from her, one evening of tears and dramatics, and suddenly, I was no longer their son. They didn't sit me down to talk about it, didn't offer any kind of compromise or attempt to fix whatever imaginary problem they had convinced themselves existed. They just told me to leave. At the time, I thought my life was over. I had no money, no plan, no safety net. I spent nights sleeping in my car, wondering how everything had fallen apart so fast. But looking back now, I realized something. They didn't ruin my life. They saved it, because if they hadn't kicked me out, I might have spent the rest of my years desperately chasing their approval, trying to be part of a family that never wanted me in the first place. Instead, they cut the cord themselves. And what they didn't realize was that karma was watching. And karma never forgets. Growing up, I had always known I wasn't as important as my sister. It wasn't something my parents ever said outright, but I could feel it in everything they did. Vanessa got the best of everything. The newest clothes, the latest technology, expensive hobbies she picked up and abandoned as soon as she got bored. If she wanted something, she got it, no questions asked. Meanwhile, I was expected to be grateful for whatever was left over. When I asked for something, even something small, I was being selfish. When I needed help with school, I was told to stop expecting so much. When I wanted their attention, I was being a nuisance. I learned early on that my role in the family was to stay out of the way. It wasn't just material things. The favoritism ran much deeper than that. My parents defended Vanessa no matter what she did. If she failed a test, they would insist that the teacher was unfair. If she got into an argument with a friend, they would assure her that the other person was jealous. If she threw a tantrum, they would soothe her, tell her she was right to feel upset, promise to fix whatever was making her unhappy. If I made a mistake, even the smallest one, I was scolded for not trying hard enough. If I failed at something, it wasn't excused. It was a reflection of who I was, another disappointment to add to the list. Vanessa could do no wrong. I could do no right. And she knew it. She used it against me every chance she got. By the time we were teenagers, it wasn't just favoritism. It was full-blown resentment. She treated me like I was beneath her, like I existed solely to make her life harder. She spread rumors about me at school, took things from my room, and acted outraged when I accused her, made fun of me in front of her friends. She enjoyed making me miserable. And the worst part? My parents let her. No matter what she did, they excused it, dismissed it, acted like I was imagining things. And if I ever tried to fight back, I was the one who got punished. At some point, I stopped trying. I stopped trying to get them to believe me, stopped trying to be part of the family, stopped hoping that things would ever be different. I started keeping my head down, avoiding conflict, planning for the day I could finally leave and never look back. I had been saving money from part-time jobs, making quiet plans for what I would do when I turned 18. It wasn't much, but it was something. I just had to hold on a little longer. But Vanessa didn't want to wait that long. It happened 2 months before my birthday. I remember the day so clearly because it was one of the few times in my life where everything changed in an instant. She came home from school crying, slamming doors, making a scene the way she always did when she wanted attention. I barely had time to process what was happening before my parents were in my room, faces full of anger. They didn't ask what had happened. They didn't give me a chance to explain. They had already decided. "She can't stand living with you anymore," my mother said, her voice sharp and final. "You need to leave." Just like that. No discussion. No warning. No second chances. I looked at my father, hoping for some kind of hesitation, some flicker of doubt. But he just sighed and muttered something about how this was for the best. Behind them, Vanessa stood at the top of the stairs, arms folded, smug satisfaction written all over her face. She had won. She had finally gotten what she wanted. I should have fought back. I should have demanded to know why they were choosing her over me yet again. But I didn't, because deep down, I had always known this was coming. I packed a single bag and walked out the door without a word. They thought they had broken me. They thought they had erased me from their lives, wiped their hands clean of the inconvenience I had always been. But what they didn't realize, what Vanessa, in all her selfish arrogance, never saw coming, was that by pushing me out, they weren't just getting rid of me. They were setting up their own downfall. Because karma was watching. And karma never forgets. The door shut behind me with a finality that I wasn't ready for. One moment, I had a home, a place to sleep, food in the fridge, and a roof over my head. The next, I was standing outside with nothing but a duffel bag, the evening air biting against my skin, my parents' words still ringing in my ears. I had spent years feeling like I didn't belong, like I was just some inconvenience they had been forced to tolerate. But I never thought they'd actually throw me away. I stood in the driveway for a long time, my mind blank, my body numb. My first instinct was to tell myself that this wasn't real, that it was just another cruel punishment meant to teach me a lesson. Maybe they expected me to grovel, to cry, to beg them to let me back in. Maybe they wanted to see me humiliate myself one last time before they reluctantly forgave me and allowed me back under their roof. But I knew better. They weren't testing me. They were done. Vanessa had gotten exactly what she wanted. I could picture her inside, basking in her victory, acting as if I had never existed. My parents were probably already moving on, relieved that their perfect daughter was happy again. They had made their choice, and it sure as hell wasn't me. I turned away from the house that had never really been my home and started walking. I didn't know where I was going. I had no money, no plan, no idea what to do next. My 18th birthday was 2 months away, and until then, I was still legally a minor. If I went to the police, what would they do? Force my parents to take me back? The thought of being dragged back inside, knowing I wasn't wanted, knowing that every second I spent there would be filled with hostility, made me feel sick. I wasn't going back. Not now. Not ever. I had no friends to call. Vanessa had made sure of that. She had spent years turning people against me, making sure I was always alone. Anyone who had ever been kind to me had either been scared off by her rumors or had seen how my family treated me and decided they wanted no part of it. I couldn't blame them. Who would want to be friends with someone whose own parents didn't want them? I walked for hours, trying to figure out what to do. I passed by the houses of kids I had gone to school with, homes that were warm and filled with laughter, families sitting down to dinner together. I wondered what it was like to be one of them, to belong somewhere, to be loved without conditions. But that wasn't my reality. My reality was that I had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. Eventually, exhaustion set in. My legs ached, my stomach twisted with hunger, and the weight of the situation finally hit me. I needed to find a place to sleep. I ended up at a gas station on the outskirts of town, sitting on the cold pavement near the dumpsters, my bag clutched tightly to my chest. The parking lot was mostly empty, except for a few cars pulling in and out, people going about their lives, oblivious to the fact that a 17-year-old kid had just been thrown away like trash. I spent my first night homeless staring up at the sky, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. The next few days blurred together in a haze of hunger, exhaustion, and desperation. I spent most of my time wandering, trying to figure out what to do next. I checked my phone obsessively, but there were no messages, no missed calls, no signs that my parents had changed their minds. They hadn't even bothered to pretend they cared. I was truly on my own. I used what little cash I had to buy cheap food from convenience stores, stretching it as far as I could. But money ran out fast when you had nothing. By the fourth day, I was starving, dizzy from hunger, and so exhausted that I could barely think straight. I knew I had to find a way to make money fast. That was when I made the first of many mistakes. I was standing outside a fast food place, watching people throw half-eaten meals into the trash, debating whether I was desperate enough to dig through it, when a guy a few years older than me walked up. He was tall, sharp-eyed, with an easy smirk that immediately put me on edge. I had seen people like him before, the type who could spot weakness from a mile away. "Rough night?" he asked, glancing at my bag, my worn-out clothes, the way I was hovering near the garbage like some stray animal. I didn't answer, but he didn't need me to. He already knew. "I've got a way you can make some cash," he said, lowering his voice slightly. "Nothing too bad. Just running errands. Easy money." I should have walked away. I should have known better. But I was cold, hungry, and desperate, and that made me reckless. So I said yes. At first, it really was easy. He gave me small tasks, delivering packages, handing off envelopes, things that seemed harmless enough. The money wasn't much, but it was more than I had, and I was too desperate to ask questions. But as the days passed, the jobs got riskier. Suspicious packages, shady meeting spots, people who looked at me like I was disposable. And then one night, I found myself in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught in the middle of something I didn't understand with no way out. I realized too late that I had walked straight into a trap. And the worst part? My parents never even knew. While I was out there barely surviving, they were living their lives like I had never existed. Vanessa was probably celebrating her latest achievement. My mother was probably bragging about her perfect daughter to her friends, and my father was probably pretending that I had never been his responsibility in the first place. They had no idea how close I came to losing everything. But fate has a funny way of working things out. Because just when I thought I had hit rock bottom, something happened. Something that changed everything. And it all started with a single phone call. There are moments in life when everything shifts in an instant. When the past you swore you had left behind comes crashing back without warning. I had spent months struggling just to survive, drifting through life with no plan, no future, and no one to rely on. I had lost everything the night my parents threw me out, and for the longest time, I had convinced myself that meant I had nothing left to lose. But that phone call proved me wrong. I almost ignored it. My phone, barely holding on to its last few percentage points of battery, lit up with a number I didn't recognize. I had gotten used to letting things go to voicemail. Most of my calls weren't from anyone I wanted to hear from, but something told me to answer, and before I could think twice, I swiped the screen. The voice on the other end was familiar in a way that made my stomach twist. It belonged to someone I hadn't spoken to in years, a distant relative. One of those people who had always hovered on the edges of family events, never too involved but always there watching. I barely remembered them, but their tone was urgent, almost hesitant, like they weren't sure if calling me had been a mistake. And then they said the words that made everything stop. Vanessa had been arrested. The golden child. The perfect daughter. The one who had spent her entire life convinced she could do no wrong. The one who had gotten me kicked out of my own home without a second thought. She had finally, inevitably, made a mistake that couldn't be covered up with empty apologies and parental excuses. And it was bad. For a moment, I thought it was a joke. Some cruel attempt to drag me back into their world for nothing. But the more I listened, the more it sank in. My parents were in full meltdown mode. They had tried everything. Pleading, bargaining, throwing around money to make the problem go away. But nothing was working. Vanessa was facing serious charges, the kind that came with actual consequences. And for the first time in her life, there was no easy escape. I asked why they were telling me this. Why, after all these years, they suddenly cared whether I picked up the phone. The answer was as pathetic as I expected. My parents were desperate. Vanessa was falling apart, unable to handle the idea that she was no longer untouchable, and their perfect little world was crumbling around them. And in their blind panic, they had come to a ridiculous, almost laughable conclusion. They thought I could fix it. I sat there in stunned silence, letting their words wash over me. My parents, the same people who had thrown me out like garbage, who hadn't checked on me once in 8 years, who had erased me from their lives without hesitation, actually believed that I would drop everything and come running back to help them. It was almost insulting. I asked what Vanessa had done, and this time, there was hesitation. They didn't want to say it outright. They were still clinging to the idea that this could be handled, that if they controlled the narrative, they could minimize the damage. But I wasn't in the mood to play their game. If they wanted my help, they had to tell me everything. And that was when I found out just how deep Vanessa had buried herself. It wasn't some minor incident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. Vanessa had been caught committing fraud. Real, undeniable fraud. Credit cards, identity theft, illegal accounts opened under other people's names. She had been running a full-scale scheme for years. And the worst part? She hadn't even been smart about it. She had gotten cocky, reckless, convinced that she was too important to ever get caught. But karma had a way of balancing the scales, and now she was looking at prison time. Not probation, not community service, real time behind bars. I couldn't stop the rush of satisfaction that ran through me. After everything she had done, after making my life hell, after ensuring that I had nothing, after turning my own parents against me, she was finally facing something she couldn't manipulate her way out of. And they had the audacity to call me the person she had destroyed, the person they had abandoned. I asked them why they thought I would care. There was a long pause, and then came the real punchline. My father's voice, quieter now, full of something that almost sounded like shame. They didn't just want me to come back for emotional support. They needed my name. Vanessa had used me. When she had been running her little scam, she hadn't just used strangers' names, she had used mine. Old information, outdated addresses, anything she could get her hands on. And now, my name was tied to her crimes. Not as the main perpetrator, but enough to raise questions. Enough to make me a suspect. Enough to pull me straight into the middle of the mess she had created. The moment I heard it, everything snapped into place. That was why they had called. Not because they cared, not because they regretted what they had done, but because they needed me to clear Vanessa's name so she could walk away clean. They wanted me to testify that I had nothing to do with it, that it must have been some horrible misunderstanding, that Vanessa wasn't a criminal. She was just confused. They didn't care that she had stolen from me. They didn't care that she had dragged me into a crime that could have ruined my future. They only cared about one thing, saving her. For a brief, fleeting moment, I considered it. Not because I owed them anything, but because I knew exactly what Vanessa was going through. The fear, the hopelessness, the feeling of being completely alone, realizing too late that you had no way out. I had lived through that when they threw me out, when I had spent nights starving, struggling to survive. I had once wondered if they ever regretted it, if they ever thought about what they had done. But now I knew the truth. They never regretted it. They never thought about me. They had only remembered me when they needed something. I let that sink in. I let them wait, probably thinking I was about to agree, that their manipulation had worked one last time. And then, I told them exactly what they deserved to hear. No, I wasn't going to help. I wasn't going to lie for Vanessa. I wasn't going to let them use me. Not again. I had spent too long clawing my way out of the hole they had left me in. I wasn't about to jump back into it just to save the sister who had spent her entire life making sure I suffered. And just like that, the panic on the other end of the line turned to rage. They didn't try to hide it anymore. My mother's voice, sharp and furious, telling me I was being selfish, that I was abandoning my family, that I was making a mistake. My father, quieter but just as angry, saying I would regret this, that I was choosing revenge over family. I could hear Vanessa in the background, crying, begging, swearing she hadn't meant for this to happen. I hung up, and in that moment, I felt truly free. They had thrown me away like I was nothing, never expecting that one day, they would be the ones begging for my help. They had built their lives around protecting Vanessa, molding the world around her, convincing themselves that she was special, untouchable. But they had been wrong. She wasn't invincible. She was just spoiled, reckless, and out of time. And this time, there was no one left to save her. Hanging up that phone felt like severing the last rotten thread that had tied me to my past. For 8 years, I had wondered if my parents ever regretted what they had done, if they ever thought about me, if there was even a small part of them that missed their son. Now I had my answer. They hadn't called because they cared. They hadn't called because they wanted to make things right. They had called because they needed me, because Vanessa had finally gone too far, and they were willing to throw me under the bus if it meant saving her. For the first time in years, I held power over them, and they hated it. In the days that followed, the messages started rolling in. First, they were polite, forced but polite. My mother tried guilt first, telling me that Vanessa had made a mistake and that I was being unfair by refusing to help. My father tried to appeal to logic, saying that I didn't want to be associated with a crime, that clearing Vanessa's name would also clear mine. When I ignored them, they became more aggressive. My mother accused me of being bitter, of taking out my childhood resentment on my innocent sister. My father warned me that if Vanessa went down for this, I was burning any chance I had of being part of this family again. That was when I finally laughed. They were still acting as if I wanted a place in their lives, as if I had been sitting around waiting for their acceptance, like I was some desperate child longing to be let back in. They didn't understand that I had already moved on. The moment they threw me out, they had stopped being my family. And now, when they needed me, they were realizing that I wasn't the same helpless teenager they had abandoned. But they weren't ready to give up. When the messages didn't work, they started digging for leverage. They knew nothing about my life now, where I lived, who I was with, what I did for work. But that didn't stop them from trying. Then, one night, I got a message from a number I didn't recognize. It was Vanessa. Her tone was different from my parents'. Desperation bled through every word. She told me she was sorry, that she had never meant to hurt me, that she was scared, that she needed me. She begged me to just talk to her, just hear her out, just give her a chance to explain. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. But then I remembered all the years she had spent making my life miserable. The rumors she had spread about me at school, the way she had stolen from me and laughed when I got in trouble for it, the way she had smirked when our parents told me to leave. I remembered sitting in a gas station parking lot, starving, wondering where I would sleep. I remembered how she had made sure I had no friends, no allies, no one to turn to when I needed help the most. And now, after all these years, the tables had turned. Vanessa wasn't on top anymore. She wasn't the golden child. She was a criminal staring down real consequences. And for the first time in her life, there was no one to protect her. That should have been the end of it. But my parents weren't done. The next week, I woke up to news articles flooding my phone. Vanessa's case had gone public. Her arrest, the fraud, the charges, it was all there in black and white. The details were worse than I had imagined. She hadn't just committed a crime. She had built a career out of it. She had been stealing money for years, opening fake accounts, taking out loans in other people's names, maxing out stolen credit cards, all while living a lavish life. Designer clothes, high-end vacations, a luxury apartment she could never have afforded on her own. My parents had funded her lifestyle without question, never once wondering where the extra money was coming from. And now it was all falling apart. People who had once praised my parents, who had admired their perfect daughter, were turning on them. The comments under the articles were brutal. People called Vanessa a spoiled brat who thought she was above the law. They mocked my parents for raising a fraudster. They speculated about how much they had really known. The police were investigating their finances, looking into whether they had benefited from Vanessa's crimes. My parents, the same people who had spent years looking down on me, were now being judged by everyone they had ever tried to impress. I watched from a distance, fascinated by how quickly their world was unraveling. For so long, they had lived in their own little bubble, convinced that nothing could touch them, that their money and influence would protect them from any real consequences. But they had made a fatal mistake. They had bet everything on Vanessa, and Vanessa had lost. As the days passed, the story only got worse. Reporters started digging deeper, uncovering more victims, more fraudulent accounts, more stolen identities. The amount of money involved was staggering. Vanessa wasn't just facing jail time. She was looking at years in prison, the kind of sentence that ruins a person's life. And my parents were drowning in the backlash. My mother had always been obsessed with appearances, with making sure the world saw us as the perfect family. Now, she was hiding from reporters, refusing to answer questions. My father, always so calm and collected, had aged 10 years overnight, caught in legal battles trying to protect what was left of their reputation. And me? For the first time in my life, I felt free. I wasn't the outcast anymore. I wasn't the unwanted son, the problem child, the one who had been thrown away. I was the only one who had escaped. I had walked away from the wreckage before it could destroy me. And now, as my parents scrambled to salvage what was left of their lives, I stood on the outside, untouched. I thought about calling them, just once, just to hear the panic in their voices. Just to let them know that I knew, that I was watching, that the son they had discarded had won. But then I realized something. I didn't need to. They already knew. Every time they turned on the news, every time they opened their phones, every time they saw Vanessa's name plastered across headlines in bold, accusing letters, they would think of me. They would remember what they had done, how easily they had thrown me away, how they had sacrificed their son for the sake of their golden child. And now, their golden child was gone. Karma had done exactly what it was supposed to do. It had leveled the playing field. And for the first time in my life, I could finally say I didn't care about them anymore. The downfall of my family didn't happen overnight. It wasn't a single, dramatic event where everything collapsed at once. No, it was slower than that. More painful. Like watching a house rot from the inside, the foundation cracking bit by bit until the walls caved in under their own weight. Vanessa was in jail awaiting trial. There would be no plea deals, no slap on the wrist, no carefully crafted story that could paint her as the misunderstood victim. The evidence against her was airtight: bank records, fake identities, stolen credit cards, emails that detailed exactly how deep her fraud had gone. She had spent years believing she was untouchable, that consequences were something that happened to other people. But now, the reality of her situation was impossible to ignore. She was done. The golden child, the one who had been worshipped her entire life, who had never faced a single hardship, was now facing years in prison. And the best part? No one was coming to save her. My parents were drowning in the mess she had left behind. Their perfect image was shattered. Reporters camped outside their house. Tabloids painted them as the disgraceful parents of a fraudster, and former friends who had once admired them were now whispering behind their backs. The same people who had spent years praising my mother's perfect family were now calling her a failure. My father, once respected in his community, was avoiding work, hiding from former colleagues who no longer saw him as the distinguished businessman he had once pretended to be. And then came the lawsuits. Vanessa hadn't just stolen from banks. She had stolen from real people. People who were furious. Victims started coming forward, filing cases against her, demanding compensation for what she had done. My parents tried to protect what was left of their wealth, but it was useless. Lawyers drained them dry, court fees piled up, and little by little, the financial empire they had spent years building crumbled. The house, the same house they had thrown me out of, was the first thing to go. They had no choice but to sell it to cover legal fees. The same house my mother had once bragged about, the one Vanessa had ruled like her own personal kingdom, was now owned by strangers. I wondered what it must have been like, watching someone else move into the place they had once believed was untouchable. Then my father lost his job. The scandal had become too big, too public. No company wanted to be associated with him. He had spent years acting like his reputation made him invincible, but in the end, it had taken just a few months for everything to collapse. I imagined my mother crying, watching as everything she had valued disappeared before her eyes. The perfect family she had built her entire identity around was gone. The house, the money, the social status, it was all slipping through her fingers, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. And me? I was watching from a distance. For years, I had lived with the weight of what they had done to me. I had carried the anger, the resentment, the pain of knowing that I had been thrown away like garbage. I had spent nights wondering if they had ever regretted it, if they had ever thought about what happened to me. Now I knew the truth. They regretted it only because they needed me, not because they missed me, not because they loved me, but because they had lost everything and were desperate to cling to anyone who could help them. I could have reached out. I could have answered their calls, could have shown up at their doorstep just to see the looks on their faces. I could have let them beg, let them plead for my help, for my support, for the son they had abandoned. But I didn't, because I didn't need revenge. I had something better. I had a life, a real life, one that had nothing to do with them, one that I had built on my own. I had a job, a home, friends who actually cared about me. I had people in my life who saw me as a person, not an inconvenience. For the first time in my life, I was truly free. Vanessa would spend years behind bars, living in the same isolation she had forced on me when I was 17. My parents would live the rest of their lives knowing that the son they had thrown away was the only one who could have saved them. And me? I was done thinking about them, because in the end, karma had done the work for me, and I was never looking back.